Okay, so this week we're going to be diving into the kind of astounding, amazing world of insect behavior and how that connects to the biology and ecology of these organisms. So just this morning, I was getting ready to go outside, pretty cold morning for September here in Wisconsin, and saw this praying mantis just outside of my door, pretty shut down and quite cold because of the cold weather and being ectotherm again. Muscles weren't at their sort of peak function on cold early morning. But these praying mantises, as just another example of sort of amazing biology that is around us all the time, often hidden. So of course these praying mantises are incredible hunters. So they are predators of sit-and-wait ambush predators of insects, but also even vertebrates anytime. So you gotta love an insect that feeds on and predates on vertebrates, a reversal of the normal pattern. So amazing biology and sort of behavior associated with actually detecting and capturing prey. And also, there's really amazing examples. This sort of brown leaf-looking mantis in the backyard is one example of many forms of mimicry and kind of camouflage and these amazing other kinds of behavior and the ways in which they hide themselves out in the world. So again, we're going to be diving into, this is sort of a nice entry, a way to start thinking about the world of insect behavior. Before we dive into that, we should really think about what is behavior. And it turns out this is a sort of amazingly complex question, actually, and kind of hard to pin down. So one definition you might see in your textbook is behavior can be defined as anything that an individual does during its life involving action in response to a stimulus. That seems to pretty much equate with anything that is the biology of insects. So it's sort of intuitive, but also maybe maybe not that helpful of a definition. Another definition I pulled from the internet is animal behavior includes all the ways animals interact with other organisms in the physical environment. Behavior can also be defined as a change in the activity of an organism in response to the stimulus, an external or internal cue or combo of cues. So in some ways, behavior is maybe really defined as just about anything that an animal does. And not even just animals, right? Plants can have behavior, bacteria can have behavior. So in some ways, behavior is just sort of action. And so again, maybe not that helpful. And it turns out this is really kind of a standing challenge in the field is behavior is actually, despite having a strong intuition, is actually not very well defined. But even if we don't have a totally clear, concise definition of behavior, there are some things that generally we all agree sort of fall under the rubric of animal behavior. So what are some things that are generally considered part of behavior? Foraging, so the way that organisms are out and insects are out gathering food, whether or not that's, again, sort of ambush predating on other insects, or out gathering nectar from flowers, foraging is usually considered part of behavior. There's amazing adaptations associated with mating and reproduction, and we're going to talk about some of today. Social behavior, so the ways in which insects interact with each other, and especially other members of the same species. How insects move and migrate, both on a small scale for foraging and other sort of local dispersal, and also long-distance migration, which we'll talk a little bit about. Learning and memory, the way that insects actually learn about their environment and use that for adaptive behaviors, again, like foraging and others. Communication, so the many, many ways through different sensory modalities that insects communicate with each other, both within species and across species. Also defense and mimicry. So we might consider all of these things sort of part of the behavioral repertoires, and this is really not exhaustive. Many, many, many other examples of things that are important aspects of behavior. So why in an insect ecology class should we care about, or are we going to spend time talking about behavior? There's a lot of reasons for that, but one is that behavior really provides the key link between insects and their environment. So for example, if you think about it, I really like this diagram from a paper from a couple years ago, just highlighting a relatively, on a small scale, sort of microclimatic variation. Here, a tree with the associated soil and a termite mound nearby. There are many, many different ways in which insects live in this environment. There's also a lot of microclimatic variation. Temperatures can vary, soil conditions vary, and actually what abiotic or biotic conditions insect experiences, what its temperature or moisture environment is like, or what species it's interacting with is actually really highly determined by how it moves through this environment. So behavior really lays the groundwork for, or is fundamentally connected to all these other physiological and other kinds of adaptations. Behavior also determines the sequencing or timing of events. For example, emergence, foraging activity, migration, and we can think of behavior as sort of structuring all these other aspects of the organismal biology of insects. And also insect diversification and ecology is really closely tied to the evolution of behavior. We can think of a lot of the evolution of insects as being an example of behaviors that evolved to allow insects to exploit different resources, remember where resources are, move through the environment and sort of select out particular partners, who they're interacting with, finding prey. A lot of the actual ecology is reflected in behavioral adaptations and also sensory processing. And one of the important concepts in this is recognizing that not all organisms and not all insects actually sense or see the world in the same way. So one of a great word for this is Umwelt, a German word for describing basically the sensory world of organisms. So one definition of this is the world as it is experienced by a particular organism. So, of course, we have particular senses, our sight, smell, touch, etc., that allow us to perceive the world in particular ways. But all those senses also have limitations, right? So we only see there's a lot of different wavelengths of light. We only see some subset of those. And our eyes are, for example, structured in a way that allow us to see particular things better than others. So if we take the example of a dragonfly, for example, or any insect, most insects have compound eyes. In the case of dragonflies, they have these large compound eyes that are really well designed for actually capturing motion, but not so much resolution. Our eyes are very good at resolution and being able to see fine-grained detail, but dragonflies need to be able to react really quickly to moving objects in there, like a fruit fly or other small flying insects that they want to eat. They need to be able to react very, very quickly. So their eyes are really well designed. And also, if we think about what wavelengths of light or what kinds of light insects see, it's actually quite different than us. So we, of course, just as a reminder, have three pigments, red, green, and blue opsins, that allow us to see those wavelengths of light. But those are different than what insects have. Insects have also three main opsins or wavelengths corresponding to wavelengths of light that they can see, but they don't see red so well, but instead they can see UV. So for example, here are just some nice examples of these butterflies down below that have color that exists in the UV spectrum that is not visible to us. So in some ways, these sort of private sensory channels that are available to particular organisms and not others. And birds, of course, can see a different subset. So just as an example demonstrating that each organism has its own subset of the world and way of sensing the world around it. So in general, if we think about why animals are doing particular behaviors, so this is really a central question in animal behavior. You see a praying mantis outside trying to capture prey, you can ask, well, why is the organism doing it? And one nice framework for thinking about the different ways in which we can answer that question of why a behavior happens was provided by Nico Tinbergen. And these sort of 4 questions or 4 levels of analysis. And one scale in which you can answer this question of why is an animal performing or taking on a behavior is really about its adaptive value. So what's the function of that? What is the sort of usefulness for example, increasing fitness? You can also think about why in a broader evolutionary sense. So for example, how did this behavior evolve from other species or across the evolutionary tree? So not just within a single species or lifetime, but across species, why is that behavior evolving and sticking around? On a more proximate scale, you can think about, well, what are the direct causes of that behavior? So for example, you see dragonfly jumping up to capture prey and move as fast as possible. What's causing that? Well, in a proximate sense, what's causing that is the stimulus of a moving object that is about the size of a mosquito or a small flying insect moving across the ommatidia of the dragonfly. So in a narrow sense, a sort of mechanistic sense, that stimulus is causing that behavior. So that is one scale of answer to why is the organism performing that behavior. And finally, we can think about a sort of developmental reason. So what within the lifespan of an individual, what are the developmental processes that give rise to and sort of put those behaviors in place? So to think through an example of this, this one is very close to home. My two young sons have started making a lot of fart jokes. And as their parents, we are often finding ourselves asking why. Why are they making these horrific jokes we can't seem to stop? And there's really a lot of different reasons to it. So one, in that short-term sense, is they've been prompted by something. Maybe something rhymes with fart, and that causes them, in the short-term sense, to make a fart joke. So that's that sort of mechanism causation reason. In maybe a longer-term sense, within their own lifespans, they've received poor parenting. So that, in their developmental trajectories, has set them up to make these fart jokes. But we can take solace in the fact that, in a broader sense, at least the language around making the jokes serves some purpose. So we think that human communication is really important for our own evolution. That's one example where this is a particular example of using that communication to connect with and transfer information to other conspecifics, in case parents or siblings. And also we can think about the evolutionary context of that language. Why was the ability to make these, again, horrifying fart jokes, why does that exist? And you can think about that in the context of how human language evolved from our ancestors. So thinking about those scales of analysis. So to walk through that same scale a bit in the insect example, we're going to talk a little bit about stag beetles. So this is a cool system, a highly diverse group of beetles, many of which have these ornate pieces of weaponry, these horns that develop on particularly male heads. And the question is, why do these beetles have this? And why are they performing the sort of fighting behavior that we used before? And one reason for that can be causation, so short-term causation of maybe they see the stimulus of another male and react to that by engaging in a fight where they use horns or these other kinds of ornate weapons. So that's the sort of proximate mechanism for why. But also we can think about the function of these horns and the associated behaviors. So in this system, for example, there's actually two successful strategies. One is using the horns to fight and sort of guard the entrance to nest sites where females are mating and laying eggs. But there's also a sneaker strategy where males will burrow in and actually sort of sneak in the side door to mate with females, so an alternative tactic. And so in a functional sense, we know that the behavior associated with these ornate male weaponry is associated with some adaptive value in finding mates and sort of fighting for these adaptive behavioral strategies. We can also think about the within the lifespan, the ontological or sort of development of these weapons and the associated behaviors. And also, we know that there's a strong evolutionary component. So very constrained by, or strong evolutionary patterns to which species have what kinds of weaponry patterns and their sort of ornateness and how they're used. So we can think about the evolutionary context of that behavior and how it's associated with these morphological and physiological adaptations. And again, insect behavior gives us just some amazing examples, especially associated with, for example, mating flights. So this is synchronous fireflies that you might have seen. These are particularly in the American South and other parts of global distribution. These amazing behaviors where we see synchronized light pulsing across all the members of our population. There's been some really nice work recently trying to actually sort of map out the dynamics of that. For example, here by Ori Peleg, a researcher at Colorado. And what she and her group have found is that these complex emergent dynamics of pulse lights are really associated with or driven by just these local patterns of paying attention to what your neighbors are doing. So there are these proximate mechanisms associated with synchronized pulsing of light, but those are tied to being able to find mates, sexual selection, so really these strong evolutionary pressures that drive these complex behaviors. Okay, so that was kind of a rapid fire overview, but hopefully a bit of an introduction to what we're going to be thinking about in this week's material. So we're going to you're going to get a little bit of a view into thinking about how behavior links insects to the environment, how they might avoid or seek out optimal or challenging conditions. Also a little bit about flight and movement, how it connects to the ecology. And also we're going to talk and take a little bit of a dive into the, in particular, social behavior of insects, which is not only fascinating, but really important for their ecology.